POIs through voice. I won't be looking at chat. 1 second. Okay. 3, 2, 1. We think that in the process of nation building, even if you are a national artist with certain obligations to your minority, it is still probably in your best interest to focus on this greater idea of nation building by highlighting unified struggles over your own specific struggles. Two pieces of framing immediately. Number one, in terms of the context that this motion takes place in, this is probably immediate post-conflict. This is not 50 years or 100 years down the line. This is the struggle has just ended, and you need probably an instance in which to unify your common people. This is because, number two, there is a lack of national unity as a consequence of the artificial divide imposed by colonizers. They were incentivized to do this in order to retain and maintain power imbalances within the country and exploiting those same conflicts to make sure they had the best ability to maintain control over your state. By highlighting unified struggles, we think this means to look at larger overarching events with the most perceived impact over specific struggles of an ethnic minority, such as smaller events that are debatably relevant to the larger struggle as a whole. And the specific struggle itself probably means to create pieces that uniquely deal with or heavily emphasize your minority during the period of colonization. Second piece of framing on the actor themselves. Number one, they probably already have an existing reputation within the state that makes their art and creations significantly more valuable at shaping the direction of growth of the country than any other artist. Number two, I think that my ethnic minority in that state is also probably particularly well represented by said actor. Number three, like the role of the national artist then finally is twofold. But number one, this is to create and preserve culturally significant pieces. But number two, that their actions themselves are directly contributory towards the greater good of a populace as a whole. The case coming from government is that the artist's best interest at this point in time is to promote a unified struggle. I'll be explaining how that's relevant specific to the context at hand, at why this has to happen immediately and why you can put some things off for later. And second, I'll
Right.
explain like what is the context of nation building and why would the artists be incentivized to do this. I'll take you later. Firstly, on multiculturalism and how probably that will still be upheld, specifically in protecting minorities. Number one, we explained earlier in the frame that you yourself, as a member of the minority, as a national artist, are probably directly representative of that said minority anyway. Note that national artists themselves are pretty well known and influential figures within the state. We think that just by virtue of being a national artist, other figures in institutions in society, such as historians or the news, have incentives to dig into your life as a mini celebrity, to bring out interesting and noteworthy events involving you and your minority group, insofar as these help to define and shape you in the end. Weighing this, number one, we think that there's still other means by which highlighting of the specific struggles still occurs at the same time. So the artist does their job, so that the benefit that this would supposedly exist exclusively on opposition isn't materialized. We think they have the burden of exclusively proving why it must be the national artist that represents the minority. We think there are probably still safety nets if opposition wants to contest that the news is not going to depict you fairly. We think the national artist, as a consequence of like the massive amounts of clout and influence that they still have at this point in time, can probably still genuinely shape the direction of the narrative that their minority is going to be held in. But number two, being a national artist is not the only place to emphasize specific struggle. But secondly, we think you can also do this later. But before that, I'll take the PY.
So isn't this crossing the house if you're also trying to claim that this national artist will still be able to platform their own specific struggles?
Yeah, later, like not in the immediate period of post-colonization. This is the important context that I framed out earlier. Now, this is where I'm going to explain why you can do this later, because it's just the immediate aftermath that dictates that you should focus on the idea of nation building first. Opposition might say, as a contestation further to this, that you need to do this now because the national identity is still malleable, that you stand a chance of cementing yourselves as a more legitimate and less oppressed group in society. Some important observations here. Number one, even if this was true, we think that as a consequence of generational imbalances of power dynamics, that because of unequal distributions of power in these states and because different ethnicities and groups were necessarily given a disproportionate amount of power by these colonizers, other actors who belong to the majority have a vested interest in making sure you don't disrupt the status quo. This looks like silencing you, threatening you, generally using your power over you, which diminishes and like ignores the context that you would have as a national artist anyway, and removes almost any other influence you would probably have in the discussion if you manage to piss off these people. Number two, this doesn't happen, that doesn't happen later, and why it's better on our side, because those same people have had time to solidify their power bases. So these sort of systemic shocks that you would like to introduce by wanting to prioritize your own minority group further with this sort of art are things that they can afford to ignore while also still gaining some impact for the artist. But number three, the immediate problematization unconstructively shifts the directions of discourse within the public and and becomes a sort of oppression Olympics, which isn't very conducive to nation building when your economy is in shambles and you don't have a functioning government. We think that there's a necessary urgency to policy making in the context that the debate takes place in that should, as much as possible, avoid delays and other such problems. The trade-off is clear. We are fine with the artist potentially doing this later in favor of immediate nation building. Not number two, the protection and establishment of your own minority's interest is something that can be accrued on both sides, just in different timelines. The second level of analysis then is going to explain the context of nation building and why the artist should be incentivized to do this. So I take national identity as a consequence of introducing forms of art as a necessity of nation building in post-conflict states. Is that in the creation of a national identity, you want to bind yourselves to a common history or event to show the eventual creation of your state at that point in time. You probably can't do this with specific struggles because that's something people instinctively flinch at, which probably doesn't get you a functioning national identity. From this, we think that pieces of art, for instance, that have specific that have general depictions shape the direction of national identity in a few ways. Number one, it embeds itself in the social consciousness as a common ground, which is why every Filipino probably knows of the Spoliarium, why the French learn of Monet and the Italians of Caravaggio. Number two, through that commonality, you emphasize the idea that you are now one state in an organic manner because this is a change that happens slowly over generations, which is why we exceptionally highlight the ability to do this, to highlight specific struggles at a later point in time when it's not the immediate aftermath of like post-colonization. But number three, this is incentivized to themselves, for the minorities, for the artists themselves. A national identity better allows minorities to interact with the greater world because it affords them an equal amount, or the very least evens out the amount of rights within post-conflict societies. And this is because in the process of creating a national identity, even if the convention is appealing to the majority, there still exists some degree of compromise for minority groups as a whole, especially for one that has as much negotiating power as a national artist. Nation building itself then is an important metric to the actor for several reasons. At number one, this is going to impact how your minority is going to be treated in the future. At number two, the actor, even if they feel like they still have an obligation to their community, still has different priorities imposed on them by the state and the public by virtue of the position as a national artist. And we think that the position itself outweighs the obligations to the group, insofar as the group comes to the benefit anyway, through indirect efforts of representation and through indirect forms of negotiation through this art. This is directly, we argue, in line with the actor because minorities, given the expectation, don't have as many resources or privileges, and therefore are in most need of the benefits of a unified national identity. For all these reasons, propose.
Hello. Just making sure I'm audible.
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay. POS through voice. Starting my speech in three, two, one. First, let's clear up this idea that struggles are likely to be highly nuanced. We agree with this, right? Sure, there are problems that are going to be specific to groups of people, but there are always going to be shared struggles like blanket nation policies, like the complete restructuring of cultures from Western nations when they enter these colonized nations that everyone is going to have experiences for. We don't think it's fair to say that you will simplify every culture to one struggle, but simply that the collective struggle will be seen as more important for these artists during the point of nation building specifically, because this is what's important for this nation to actually have a national identity. These experiences are going to exist regardless. But let's engage on this idea of different experiences, right? We can concede to the fact that they're going to have different nuances and they have better ways of visualizing, for example, like their specific experiences. But we think, first of all, it's an assertion in the first place that as a national artist, you have no idea how collective struggles work. Their entire case is mechanized by the fact that you have a better idea of how your specific struggles work. But we think that by virtue of being a part of the larger collective, you still have a high viscerality on how you were oppressed as a nation rather than just specific ideas. Secondly, I don't see how this can't manifest in the way in the way you represent shared struggles. It's precisely because you have unique experiences as a minority that your perception of shared struggle is going to be more representative of the struggles of the minorities. Even shared struggles are going to be more nuanced, but at the very least, it's going to be more understood by people outside of your minority culture because they also share these struggles. I think they're more easily able to understand than the nuances of your specific situation then. Lastly, you're still a national artist. I think we can claim that you still have the incentive to make good art and are unlikely to half-ass your art just because it's less proximate to you if we concede to that at the end of the day. Second thing I'm going to discuss is on principle. We think that, sure, they have a principal obligation to the ethnic minority, but the obligation to the collective for making you a national artist and celebrating your art still exists, right? You have as much an obligation to your local community as you have to the larger national community that fought for you and your collective struggles, often shouldering the burdens for the minority who were more powerless during the times of colonialism by virtue of being more vulnerable and more oppressed. This larger community is what helped you get out of the situation in the first place. We think the obligation is equal, if not greater, to them, right? Sure, in our world,
Point.
you would put less of a priority on your obligation to your community, but it's significantly worse on their side, where you actively go against the obligation to the larger community by putting your specific problems above all else and making it a sort of oppression Olympics. I'll explain later. Before that, I'll take a point.
So this is not an oppression Olympics. This is simply about you upholding your truth when you concede that it's only this artist can do it because no one in the majority knows your struggles.
Okay, we can concede that you're the only one who knows your specific struggles, but we're not going to concede that you can't represent that through through the collective struggles. You're still going to have a nuanced idea of these collective struggles. I think both houses should agree on this, right? Let's talk about multiculturalism and the artist's interest to promote their own culture. The trade-off we take on government is that there's less specific representation in the short term. Note that in our world, we're not completely removing this representation, hence prioritization, and conversely, like it's not removed enough. This debate is on extents, but we're also willing to just hardline this and willing to defend the extreme case where you completely represent majority problems and either wait a very long time to be able to represent your own culture or just to rely on other artists to do it for you. How do we get better representation for minorities anyway? Artists get more popularity among the populace and more of a platform as a result on our side, right? This is where we engage with their argument on popularity. What did people want to see during a time of post-colonization, right? They want to celebrate their combined success against the colonizers. What does it look like when you highlight specific ethnic minorities? First, best case is that they get overshadowed and are faced with confusion because the majority is more focused on celebrating their freedom from colonizers. But the worst case, secondly, is that people will feel like you're pushing your own struggles on them and invalidating the collective struggles by seeing the struggles you experience as a minority is necessarily going to be worse, is more important. But thirdly, it creates more of a divide because it feels like you're othering the ethnic minorities by making it more specific to them and not about them as a member of the collective. We think this applies even if you're already the most revered artist because the viscerality of your art and its messages are likely to be more proximate to them than just your image. They concede to this by saying that popularity is fleeting, but we think you need this the most now when the populace is easily swayed to your side by appealing to what the population wants to see. They say you maintain popularity by making good art, but just dismiss our art as going to be bad. We think this is untrue. This analysis is important for two reasons, right? This extends on why it's important to avoid it now more than any other time in the past or the future, because the idea of people wanting to celebrate their collective victory over their struggles is more visceral than anything at that point in time. But secondly, this explains the prerequisite that you would need to achieve before you can get benefits of support for your own minority culture. Even if you're not able to get support for minorities in the short term, why are you likely to get it better in the long run on Gov? One, because of the increased amount of popularity you get from people enjoying your work and continuing to support you as a national artist, rather than becoming a controversial figure that Op wants to pose, you get a larger platform and a more accepting supporter base when you do decide to highlight minority problems later in your career. But secondly, you don't have to be the one highlighting your own culture when you yourself can be celebrated in the future as someone who was pivotal to the greater nation building cause who happens to be from this minority culture. They try to say that this is tokenistic at best, but this is untrue. First, we think historians and other artists in the future will have incentive to study your work and your culture and take inspiration from it. That is inevitably going to be representative of your own culture. But even if it was tokenistic, there's something that can be remedied in there's something that can be remedied in the future when you get better representations of it anyway, right? Here we disprove the necessity to be immediate. Then let's weigh this against their worst harms. At worst, the harm you get from not solving this immediately is that people will treat minorities like they have during colonial periods, being similar to them although separated. We're fine with this because the culture has endured this for a long time, even with the oppression from the colonizers. And removing that factor, we think they can afford to endure the separation for a little longer, right? But secondly, the solution that comes immediately is not going to be solvent of common societal problems like lesser representation in politics and inherent racism against minorities. At this point, opposition has a colossal burden to prove that the immediate, albeit less representation for minority problems, is going to translate to better solvency for their problems, right? What Eldridge explains that is unresponded to is that the policy making during this period comes from a necessity for the greater community that can't afford to accommodate every single minority culture that they need to to accommodate, right? Even if we concede that the minority culture is more in need of highlighting, we're willing to take this trade-off insofar as they can't mechanize the way that they're going to get the support well on or this support well on their side, right? Let's just tie this back to the actor real quick. We think that being nationally revered, the info site explicitly tells you that you're the most revered and likely to be the most influential to this. We think that nation building is therefore in your best interest, and forming a national identity is your burden as part of your burden, even as a member of your minority community, and it's prerequisite to forming this minority identity in the future. Because of all these reasons, side with Gov.
Hello. Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
All right. Oh, fine. I won't open my camera then. Um, Let me just prep up my timer. POI preference through voice. No preferred gender pronouns. Again, through voice, I will not be looking at chat. All right. Where's my speech? Okay. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, and 1. When you portray Tausugs as people who are going through their own individual struggles as a way to say that, hey, please listen to us. There is something that's going on with us when everyone else around you is celebrating the fact that the entirety of the Philippines is finally free from the Spaniards, from the Americans, whoever is colonizing you. I think when you problematize something that should not have been seen as a problem in the first place, at this point in time, is when you create othering, is when you create tensions between individuals, because it feels like you are trying to ruin the moment. It feels like you as a national artist is getting too into your head and you're too cocky. I don't think then the idea of how you deal with divide, how you deal with the fact that people are not listening to you is best resolved under opposition. That's what I'm going to be dealing with. First thing I want to do is do a quick call out on both the first two constructive speakers of OP. Let's find check and alright. No, I don't think they can just say that the unified struggle is a myth. I don't think that it is. Regardless of how it manifests, obviously it's going to be different depending on the individuals, because of course that's just how the world works. The people understand that they all befell because of the colonizers. Your perception might be, it might be a myth, but it doesn't feel like that to the majority of the people. There is something that they will listen to, there is something that they'll probably think about for the rest of their lives. That's not something you dismiss very quickly. But also on their ability to say that, oh, it's going to be tokenistic representation. Oh, you're unheard, so you should make sure that people listen to you. Oh, you have a fleeting popularity, so you should be able to do whatever is best for you. The reason why they get away with this kinds of accusations, because, and I want you to note this panel, they do not engage with the counterfactual that we gracefully already gave for you from the first speaker. But sure, if it is tokenistic, that's okay, because the perception that revolves around that is that, wow, you're from an ethnic minority, but you're a really, really good artist. It's really nice. I think this line of thinking is better than what happens in opposition when you problematize. And that is that when like, oh, why are you making a problem right now? I think we should be happy. I hate you. Why are you making this such an issue? If the issue is that people have bad takes on you, then this gets resolved and at least won't be a systemic shock as much as it would be on opposition. Second, unheard. You will be more unheard in opposition, and now it's by your own people organically. The way for you to be heard is when you understand how the people will most likely perceive you at this point in time, find a way to deal with that. Op doesn't get that. But thirdly, the fleeting popularity. It's an issue on both, sure. I'll explain that popularity disappears instantly on opposition when you make something an issue when it shouldn't be in the first place. When there is a bigger obligation that the majority is going to push onto you, that is important because the way that you get your ability to be called a national artist relies on the nation, not just by the ethnic minority you're part of. Your fame doesn't exist on both. You can have support from the ethnic minority, but your reputation is reliant on the majority. It's national in the first place. They can't just ignore that. Very clearly then, LO doesn't have really good callouts here. But let's check quickly on DLO. If the response from DLO is true about the myth, etc., and like there is no divide, then national artists would cease to exist. The reason why national artists exist in the first place is because they give you an image of what the nation should look like. They're the comfort that people turn to. if truly they can't say that and then say in the same breath that, oh, national identity is exclusionary, that's the reason why we have to deal with the unified struggle then, to make sure that it doesn't become exclusionary as much as it can. A lot of the attempts to respond then are pretty low. Let's talk about then on the issue, and it's going to be mainly one with a lot of sub-issues there. Sure, go ahead.
So if we say that everyone will be able to relate to the unified struggle, why in the first place will people have regionalism in the first?
You literally say that to your end that it is exclusionary. The moment that you make it more known that there is different struggles and you make it seem like, oh, you don't care about everyone else, because if you focus and highlight this deliberate attempt of you trying to ignore the unified struggle, obviously it's going to be worse. Please, it is something, this POI is literally answered by your own contracted speakers. I don't know why it is something that being thrown around. All right. Where do you actually accrue the benefits you want to care about as a national artist? Op says your obligation exists for the ethnic minority because 1, you're a member of that group and that is your representation, and 2, you're the best actor that knows the intricate details of the struggle. So let's deal with the obligation issue, right? Let's vibe check. We can concede that you have the obligation because you are a member. But big question. That's the only way for you to fulfill the obligation. From the get-go, the obligation you should be caring about is to not increase the negativity people have on your group, which comes when you, 1, dismiss the unified struggle that people felt, and 2, people perceive that you are othering your group in a weird oppression Olympics. We tell you that the perceptions of the people are worse when you do this, precisely because of how people feel and prioritize during this point in time, which is to celebrate the people and finally understand that you are finally free from the colonizers. There's already divide existing prior because of the framing that comes from our first speaker. And when you deliberately do not talk about that, obviously people will not react the way that you wanted. They'll feel confused, and that's the best case. But because of the confusion, people then don't understand how to deal with you, what you exactly want in the first place for trying to highlight this entirely. Why is it important to consider the debate? There's a reason why we push the goal of national building. Because 1, your reputation is reliant on the majority, and 2, if the battle is on obligation, where do we ensure that coincides with what you want to achieve later on in life? Your success at representation is reliant on how people will take it as well. All doesn't end up winning in this clash when they deliberately skirt around how people react. We have to understand, right? In this context, intentions will be dog-washed if the majority can silence you. It is not just the people on the ground, but also by the government officials, which is something that they deliberately also ignore. How, obviously, when people feel like you are shaking the status quo, if you are ruining how people are feeling about this, about the liberation, obviously will try to do their best to kill you out. That is how your fleeting popularity already disappears. You as an ethnic minority know how volatile that is. And so when you try to go against the grain, obviously at a point in time where the stakes are high, where your point of entry to be more popular is literally right in front of you, is very easy to grab, and then you just don't grab it, obviously everything will turn against you. If representation then is the biggest goal that we want to achieve, when we already prove to you that the representation that you get is something that is more negative, is something that people at best don't know how to deal with, is when you don't achieve anything at all under opposition. We tell you very clearly, we deal with a trade-off. Best case, we get rep, sure, whatever. That is fine if we have to take the trade-off now. There's something we can achieve later. But even if it's something that we cannot, we at least don't make it worse on perception on the minority. If truly your fame is fleeting, then we don't jeopardize which ruins you not just an artist that represents that ethnic minority, but also just an artist as an individual. Those things take precedence, and for you to achieve everything later on in life, those have to take priority. With that, proud to post. Thanks.
Thanks, Gov Whip. Now calling on opposition whip. You're here.
Just give me a few.
Thank you.
POIs through voice, please. Okay. So can I confirm if I can continue with the speech, or does Orcam need to continue the recording first?
Yes, you can continue to your speech.
Okay, thank you. Unity is best achieved not through a tokenistic lie, but a truth that only you can tell, and a truth that empowers artists and everyone in the nation to tell their own. There are a few things that I'll do in the speech. The first is I'll talk about support and why it's often easier for you as that artist to do that when you emphasize your own art and your own identity, even if it comes at the cost of controversies and the like. Secondly, I'll talk about representation and why, if it's the case that you have a greater obligation to the national cause, it is where we get genuine and better representation when you choose to do this. Before that, I want to make one large call out in terms of this government strategy. If it's the case that everyone believes in the unified struggle, it doesn't mean then that one artist talking about their own identity means that you trigger a massive outcry or a massive regionalistic war between these groups. If this does happen, this concedes to what we have established on the two speakers, that the unified narrative is fragile because it's false. It's fragile because it has done nothing but silence people and tell them to put aside their grievances, to put aside their suffering in favor of the elite, in favor of the majoritarian who oftentimes are not representative of their culture or their interests. And that is why they can't take their cake and eat it. Either you say that everyone is empathetic to this unified narrative, and therefore you as a national artist, propping up an independent narrative from this as well will not be met with so much outcry, but will be met with sympathy, especially when this happens so soon right after the revolution ends. Or it will be met with massive backlash, and therefore you have to believe what we said coming from the second argument from Cara and the extension coming from Chelsea, where it's even more urgent for you to prop up this narrative anyway, because either it gets misrepresented or it gets undervalued down the line, or that you don't have any other opportunity to do this at all. The first issue then I want to discuss is on support. We gave one basic argument that comes from side government that is repeated down the bench, which is that you want to cement a shared history and a commonality between the majority group, and that is why you are able to cement your legacy as an artist. There are two things here though. The first is we have explained that unity here is not on the lacking. It is post-conflict, and it's oftentimes the best time for people to be humanized. That's because you were brothers in arms. That's because you were all victims. You were all oppressed by the oppressor. And that's the best time for you to introduce specific problems, because you're not going to be met with instant backlash, right? Given that if these are the people that you have died beside with, your brothers have died beside with, that is not likely to be the case. But the problem is it's temporary. The comparative on government bench is worse, right? When you have to do it later on. Number one, we are accused of threatening the peace of this national identity that you yourself built on. That's because you did not introduce this later on. It's number two, and this is the flip, right? This is where you get more of oppression Olympics, because people are now more unempathetic, because memories of struggle and violence, because of how traumatic they tend to be, are ones that people over time will try to forget, over time will try to move on. And that's where you get the insensitive questions of, why are you saying this now? We're already at an era of peace. We're already at an era of reconstruction and further celebration. Like if said government says that people will be mad because you are celebrating a victory, and people are already in the relief stage, and that is where you try to disrupt their peace, then that suggests that it is actually worse when you introduce controversial problems later on, because that's where that peace is already much more magnified. That's where that peace is much more already accepted, and people are already used to that. And that's why any disruption that you do is more likely to get a lot more backlash there. That's why you can't co-opt that. But even if you end up being a controversial figure, why is validating your group more important than the ones of the majority? Firstly, in terms of assurance, the majority can turn their back on you because they have selfish interests to secure their own narratives. They have their own artists that they want to prop up. The title of having the most renowned national artist is something that can be given and taken. It's not like something that You can mandate people to just respect you until the end of time, but your own group will not leave you. And that is under the condition that they don't feel betrayed just because you bite into this narrative that they don't resonate with. But secondly, on self-fulfillment, if you came from an ethnic minority, you have been silenced for so long, you will feel a lot of immense guilt when on the few times that you could have spoken out, not just on behalf of your own group, guys, this is not detached. On behalf of your own struggles and on your own experience, we would say that this is wasted opportunity for you. What the case does is two things. Firstly, this deals with our worst case, where the majority group is likely to shun you. Note how side government doesn't deal with this to the same extent, where we explained, even if the majority group isn't openly discriminatory, they will just abandon you or just think that you're not important later down the line. We engage with that. But secondly, what is left standing, we explained, was on the idea of legacy. That it's easier for you to fade when other artists are obviously likely to flock into this type of strategy on cementing their fame. But secondly, where can you best represent your art, right? We explained that it's more important, because people don't remember the label of a national artist to remember the art, but how well that art was made. And we explained why, in terms of representing and portraying that art, you're better off doing it when it's your own experience and something that you resonate with, for all the reasons that we've explained. The last issue then I want to talk about on representation. And I want to point out that it is inherent on their side that when you unify, you will have to oversimplify. Note that on weighing, our worst case, where they overlook your struggles and your contributions as a minority group, is their best case, where this is an assured harm because you chose to prioritize the unified narrative that's often oversimplified and often elitist. But secondly, let's weigh then further on extents. Where is it more likely to be overlooked? And we explained that there are strong unifying narratives already because it's inherent to a revolution. It is sure that you're divided by colonizers, but the moment that you choose to take up arms, the moment that you choose to form an army, that already disappears. But secondly, it's the self-interest of the majority to prop up that they're the unifying narrative because they want to cement power. And this is where the flip happens, right? Absent your ability to uniquely represent your own unique struggles, one, there's no countervailing narrative to the often oversimplifying and elitist ways that nation building happens. But two, at worst, you are more vulnerable to being misrepresented or attempts to devalue you and your group because the interest of most other groups is to prop up stereotypes and caricatures and rely on this, absent literature and art that you yourself prop up and truth that you yourself can only tell. For all those reasons, side with optics.
Thanks, Upwith. Now calling on Op reply. Here.
Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Like, there's basically only one rule in reply, no new matter. The first words we get from up reply are a new example that they used to attempt to justify and grandstand their case. And I think the only thing longer than up reply was the list of inconsistencies with their case. Number one, if this debate was a question of popularity being an important factor as to how the actor can act, then opposition is losing because you're nose diving straight into the grounds of unpopularity when you go against the majority. This is something that we explain at PM that LO wanted to conveniently ignore. But secondly, this is tied to the fact that opposition has absolutely no trade-off. We are fine with a short-term loss and prefer to shape the direction of your own minority in the long term and instead try to fix your position via national identity in the immediacy. Opposition has to lose something. It is either the functioning national identity as a whole or the immediacy of the identity appearing. A majoritarian national identity in of itself doesn't mean actively telling people to keep their problems to themselves. It is to accept those while primarily teaching kids in schools the events as experienced and relevant to the majority. To quote their whip, you are all brothers in arms and you all experience these problems. This is literally a line that supports our side. Notice that we never once argue that minorities shouldn't be able to get forms of redress and representation because that's just absurd, right? We implicitly explain that there are reasons to do this in the future and not now because your focus as an artist is not just as a one-dimensional as, woe is my minority. We explain that there are probably institutions and people that have vested interest in making sure that you don't disrupt the status quo and thereby disrupt their own ability to maintain their holds on power. Unlike what DLO did not hear, we did weigh why the nation building is important to the actor at first, which is why probably the speech they should be most focused on. More clearly, it is important to the actor because if what opposition says is true, that an obligation to your minority exists, then participation in that same process dictates how your minority will be treated in the future, and that is the exact way that we provide. As we explained throughout the bench, even if the obligation to your minority exists, there is also an equal, if not greater, responsibility to the general public as a consequence of your position. Now, more specifically, let's evaluate opposition case. And the one line that we get repeated in different ways is that specific struggle good. Number one, I don't think this necessarily engages with the prioritization that we set in terms of national identity as in line with the actor's interest. I think at most we have tangential levels of response and tangential levels of engagement where they attempt to shoehorn this idea of, oh, and this is also how it deals with national identity. That doesn't work. But number two, their inherent mechanism is faulty because you don't become a national artist primarily because your minority group supports you. And it is often because the majority ends up dictating the position. This is because a lot of people in your own country end up supporting you, even if this involves some people in your minority group. Sure, you have your own group support, but absent that support, and let's evaluate this, you are still a national artist. Unlike on our side, if you somehow lose the majority support, you are no longer a national artist. There are three pieces under this. Number one, this is important because it directly engages with the feasibility of solvency of their imagined problems because they explain that, oh, no, this is actually a unified country already with existing national identity. And then the same breath later on, they explain, oh, no, there are stereotypes and some people do hate each other. That doesn't make sense because you want to avoid these problems through the introduction of a national identity. That doesn't sound like a very well-functioning national identity. But secondly, if that was true in the first place, secondarily, it also means that even if, as opposition says is their worst case, you only have the support of your group, you are oppressed as much as they are because they are ignored for the same reasons, that because you consequently belong to the minority. But finally, this push from opposition was explicitly resolved the Prime Minister if they cared to treat with all of our analysis mechanisms, such as other people that can do this. But secondly, if the national artist makes a portrait about the moral liberation of Mindanao, it's not that the people in Manila will feel excluded, it's that they won't give a shit. In the context of post-conflict, you need people to care. You need as much buy-in as possible because if not, you're left with a rotting carcass of a country and people who fail to unify. This is why their NASA doesn't fly. This is why, unlike what opposition tells you, memories of oppression within a minority group never fade. These become embedded as a sort of story of violence and visceral action and desperate struggle time after time. For all these reasons, propose.